The morning mist clung to Pine Ridge Valley like smoke from a dying campfire, and through it came the sound of hoofbeats. 7 riders emerged from the gray dawn, their horses breathing steam in the cold air. They rode with the casual arrogance of men who had never been told no by anyone who lived to repeat it. At the center of the group sat Carl Mendoza, a man whose expensive coat and silver-trimmed saddle spoke of money earned through other people's misery. His pale eyes swept across the small homestead below, taking in the neat cabin, the well-maintained corral, and the woman standing beside the fence with a coffee cup in her hands. Laura Cook watched them approach with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that sudden movements drew the wrong kind of attention. She was 47 years old, with silver threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. Her clothes were practical, worn leather and flannel that had seen honest work, and her boots were scuffed from walking rough ground. The riders pulled up 20 yards from her fence, close enough to make their intentions clear, but far enough to feel safe. Mendoza leaned forward in his saddle, his smile as cold as the morning air. "You would be the widow Cook," he said. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to being feared. "I am Carl Mendoza. Perhaps you have heard the name." Laura took a slow sip of her coffee. "Cannot say that I have." The admission seemed to amuse him. "Well, Mrs. Cook, I represent certain business interests in the territory, interests that have taken note of your situation here." "My situation," she repeated. "A woman alone trying to work a claim that defeated her husband." Mendoza gestured at the cabin and corral with casual dismissal. "This is hard country, Mrs. Cook. Dangerous for someone without proper protection. I manage well enough. For now. But winter is coming, and there are many hazards in these mountains. Accidents happen to isolated homesteads. Fires start. Fences get cut. Stock wanders off." Laura set her coffee cup on a fence post with deliberate care. The movement was economical, precise, and something in it made Ronald Brown, Mendoza's lieutenant, shift uncomfortably in his saddle. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Mendoza? I am offering you an opportunity. My associates and I are prepared to purchase your claim for a fair price. More than fair, considering the difficulties you face. What if I am not interested in selling?" Mendoza's smile widened. "Everyone is interested in the right offer, Mrs. Cook. The question is whether they accept it while the terms remain generous." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Laura studied each face, noting the positions of their hands, the way they sat their horses, the bulge of weapons beneath their coats. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and level. "I suggest you leave before this gets complicated." The words hung in the cold air like a challenge. Ronald Brown actually laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the cabin walls. "Complicated." Mendoza shook his head. "Mrs. Cook, I have 12 men in this valley. You have a coffee cup and good intentions. Nothing about this is complicated." Laura met his gaze without flinching. "Some things should not be taken, Mr. Mendoza. My land is one of them. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Because what these men do not know about Laura Cook is going to change everything. But to understand how a quiet widow came to face down 7 armed men without a tremor in her voice, we need to go back. Back to 3 weeks earlier, when the first signs appeared that Pine Ridge Valley was about to become a very dangerous place. The trouble began with tracks in the snow. Laura had been checking the fence line on a gray November morning when she found them. Boot prints that had no business being on her land. They were large, made by expensive boots with distinctive heel marks, and they led from the tree line to her cabin and back again. Someone had been watching her. She knelt beside the clearest print, her trained eye reading details that most people would miss. The depth told her the man's approximate weight. The length of stride indicated height and confidence. The wear pattern on the sole suggested someone who spent more time on horseback than walking. Most telling of all, the tracks showed no attempt at concealment. Whoever had made them wanted her to know they had been there. Laura stood and brushed snow from her knees, her mind already cataloging the implications. In her previous life, before Pine Ridge Valley, before the cabin and the quiet mornings with coffee and solitude, she had been someone who understood the language of threats, someone who knew that tracks in the snow were often followed by blood in the snow. But that life was supposed to be over. She had come to Pine Ridge Valley 5 years ago with her husband Thomas, seeking the peace that had always eluded them in their former profession. They had built the cabin with their own hands, cleared the land, started a small horse breeding operation. For 3 blessed years, they had lived like normal people, sleeping through the night without weapons within reach, walking to the barn without checking sight lines and escape routes. Then Thomas had died. Not from a bullet or a knife, but from a heart that simply stopped beating one winter morning. He had gone to sleep beside her and never woken up, leaving her alone with the horses and the memories and the carefully buried knowledge of who she used to be. The tracks in the snow told her that someone had discovered her secret. Laura spent the morning following the trail, noting where the watcher had positioned himself for the best view of her daily routine. He had been thorough and patient, probably observing her for several days, the kind of surveillance that meant serious trouble was coming. By noon, she had made her decision. The cache was hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards, in a space that Thomas had helped her create when they first built the place. Even in retirement, old habits died hard. Inside the waterproof container were items from her previous life, items she had hoped never to need again. Her badge was tarnished but still readable. Deputy U.S. Marshal Laura Hawkins. The name felt strange in her mind, like a word in a foreign language she had once spoken fluently. Beneath the badge lay her service weapon, a Colt single-action Army revolver that had never failed her in 7 years of hunting the worst men the frontier had to offer. The gun felt familiar in her hand, the weight and balance as natural as breathing. She had carried this weapon through the badlands of Arizona, the mining camps of Colorado, and the cattle towns of Kansas. It had put down men who thought themselves untouchable, men who believed that money and fear made them invincible, men like the one whose tracks circled her cabin. Laura cleaned and loaded the Colt with the methodical care of long practice. 6 rounds, each one placed with the precision of someone who had learned that in her profession, you rarely got a second chance to make a first impression. The rest of the cache contained other tools of her former trade. A second pistol, a knife with a worn bone handle, ammunition, and a small leather portfolio containing warrants and correspondence from her days as a federal marshal. Reading through them brought back memories she had worked hard to bury. The Dalton Gang, the Rourke Brothers, Blackjack Santee, names that had once struck fear across 3 territories, all of them brought to justice by the quiet woman who now called herself Laura Cook. She had been good at her job, too good perhaps, the kind of good that made enemies, the kind that followed you even when you tried to disappear. That evening, as she sat by the fire with the Colt within easy reach, Laura found herself remembering Thomas's words from their last conversation about the old days. "You cannot run from what you were," he had said. "You can only choose what you do with it." At the time, she had thought he was talking about guilt, about the men she had killed in the line of duty. Now she understood he had been talking about something else entirely, about the fact that some skills, once learned has truly left you, about the reality that the frontier was full of men and men who would always see a woman alone as easy prey, about the necessity of being ready when they came calling. The next morning brought fresh snow, but no new tracks. Whoever had been watching her was being more careful now, or perhaps waiting for something. Laura used the time to prepare, checking sight lines from the cabin, noting cover positions, planning fields of fire. It felt strange to be thinking in those terms again, to be seeing her peaceful homestead through the eyes of someone who expected violence. But the transformation was already underway, the quiet widow giving way to the woman who had once been feared from Tombstone to Deadwood. She did not have to wait long. 3 days after finding the tracks, they came for her horse. Black Tusk was a stallion worth more than most men made in a year, a coal-black Mustang with the speed of the wind and the heart of a warrior. Laura had spent 2 years gentling him, earning his trust through patience and understanding rather than force. He was the finest horse she had ever trained, and more than that, he was the last gift Thomas had given her before his death. She found the corral gate standing open in the pre-dawn darkness, the lock cut clean through with professional tools. Black Tusk was gone, along with 2 of her mares. The thieves had been quiet and efficient, the kind of professionals who knew their business. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed that a widow living alone would not know how to read the signs they left behind. Laura knelt beside the corral gate, studying the marks in the frozen mud. 4 men, moving with military precision. They had used a rope to lead Black Tusk away, but the stallion had not gone willingly. His hoofprints showed the stuttering gait of an animal being forced against its nature. The trail led north toward the high country, where the pines grew thick and the valleys ran deep and narrow. Dangerous country for pursuit, which was exactly why they had chosen it. They expected her to report the theft to the territorial authorities and wait for justice to take its slow course. They did not expect her to come after them herself. Laura saddled her remaining horse, a steady mare named Sage, and checked her weapons one final time. The colt rode in a holster on her hip, hidden beneath her heavy coat. A rifle went into the saddle scabbard, and the bone-handled knife found its familiar place in her boot. She had been a tracker before she became a marshal, learning the skill from her Apache stepfather in the years after her parents died. She could read ground like scripture, follow a trail that others could not even see, move through wilderness like smoke through trees. The men who had taken Black Tusk were about to learn what it meant to steal from someone who had spent 7 years hunting the unhuntable. The trail led through country that grew progressively more rugged as the morning wore on. Laura followed it with the patience of someone who understood that haste in pursuit usually led to ambush or error. She noted every broken twig, every displaced stone, every mark that told her how far ahead they were and how confident they felt. Too confident, as it turned out. By midday, she could smell their cook fire. They had stopped to rest in a clearing beside a mountain stream, certain that no pursuit would come so quickly or follow so surely. Laura left Sage tied in the trees and moved forward on foot, using skills that had not dulled despite 5 years of peaceful living. The camp was exactly what she expected. 4 men, professional and well-armed, sitting around a fire with the casual ease of those who believed themselves safe. Black Tusk stood tethered nearby, his ears back and his eyes showing white with stress. Laura recognized the type immediately. Military deserters most likely, or discharged soldiers who had found civilian life too tame for their taste. They moved with the discipline of men who had served together, and their weapons were clean and well-maintained. She counted their guns, noted their positions, planned her approach. 4 against 1, but she had the advantage of surprise and terrain. More importantly, she had something they lacked, the absolute certainty that she was in the right. The shot came at 20 yards, clean and precise. The man standing guard dropped without a sound, the rifle spinning from his hands as Laura's bullet took him center mass. The others scrambled for cover, their easy confidence evaporating like morning mist. "You are surrounded," Laura called from the trees. "Release the horses and ride out, and no one else needs to die." The response came in the form of gunfire. Wild shots that splintered bark and whined off stones but came nowhere near their target. These men were used to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers, not trading shots with someone who had learned her craft hunting Apache raiders and Mexican bandits. Laura moved through the trees like a ghost, changing position after each shot, never giving them a clear target. Her second bullet took the man trying to flank her position, a clean shot through the shoulder that spun him around and sent his pistol flying into the stream. The third man broke cover and ran, crashing through the underbrush like a panicked deer. Laura let him go. Fear would carry the story of what happened here faster than bullets, and she wanted word to spread about the widow who was not quite what she seemed. The last man, older and steadier than the others, called out from behind a fallen log, "Who are you, lady? This is not how civilians fight." Laura stepped into the clearing, her colt held steady on his position. "The name they used to call me was Hawkins, Deputy U.S. Marshal Laura Hawkins." The silence that followed was worth more than gold. She could practically hear the man's mind working, connecting the name to stories he had heard in saloons and bunkhouses across the territory. Stories about the marshal who never missed, who could track a whisper across stone, who had brought in more wanted men than any lawman in the territories. "I heard you were dead," he said finally. "I got better. Now step out where I can see you and we will discuss the terms of your departure." The man emerged slowly, his hands raised but his eyes calculating. He was thinking about the gun on his hip, wondering if he was fast enough to clear leather before she put a bullet in him. Laura had seen that look 100 times before. It always ended the same way. Do not, she said quietly. You are not that fast, and I am not that merciful. The man's hand stopped halfway to his gun. Smart choice. Now unbuckle your gun belt and step away from it. Then help your friend with the wounded shoulder, and both of you cried out, if I see you in this valley again, I will not be so generous. They left at a gallop, the wounded man swaying in his saddle but staying upright through sheer determination. Laura watched them disappear into the trees, then turned her attention to Black Tusk. The stallion nickered softly as she approached, recognizing her scent and voice. She ran her hands over his legs and body, checking for injuries, whispering the gentle words that had always calmed him. He was unharmed but shaken, and it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by rough handling. It was not until she was leading him back toward the trail that Laura noticed the brand on the dead man's horse. A circle M burned deep into the animal's flank. She had seen that mark before, on horses ridden by men who worked for the larger ranches in the territory, men who worked for Carl Mendoza. The revelation that Mendoza was behind the horse theft changed everything. Laura had heard the name whispered in the towns below the valley, always with the kind of fear that came from knowing someone had money, men, and no conscience about using either. Carl Mendoza had built his empire on other people's misfortune, buying up failed homesteads and mining claims for pennies on the dollar. Those who refused to sell often found themselves facing mysterious accidents, burned barns, poisoned wells, or worse. The territorial authorities knew about Mendoza but could never prove anything. He was too careful, too well connected, and too willing to eliminate witnesses. But he had made a mistake when he decided to target the widow cook. Laura spent the evening preparing for what she knew was coming. The theft of Black Tusk had been a test, a way to gauge her reaction and capabilities. The fact that 4 professional gunmen had been sent running by a single woman would not sit well with a man like Mendoza. He would escalate, bringing more men and more violence until she either sold or died. She had no intention of doing either. The cash beneath the floorboards yielded more treasures from her past. A badge case containing warrants that had never been served, including one for a man named Ronald Brown who bore a striking resemblance to one of Mendoza's lieutenants. A small leather journal filled with notes and observations from her marshaling days, and at the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, a second gun belt that had belonged to Thomas. Her husband had been a Texas Ranger before they met, and his Colt Peacemaker bore the scratches and wear marks of a weapon that had seen hard use. Laura strapped on the second gun belt, feeling the familiar weight of twin pistols on her hips. She had not worn 2 guns since her last official case, but something told her she was going to need every advantage she could get. The next morning brought visitors of a different sort. Laura was mucking out Black Tusk's stall when she heard the sound of a single horse approaching at an easy lope. She stepped out of the barn to see a familiar figure riding up the trail. Noah Foster, who ran the general store in Pine Ridge Town and served as the unofficial mayor of the small community. Noah was a good man, honest and hardworking, but he wore the expression of someone carrying bad news. He dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave with concern. Morning, Laura. Mind if we talk? Of course, she gestured toward the cabin. Coffee is still warm. They sat at her kitchen table, the morning light streaming through windows that Thomas had cut and fitted with his own hands. Noah accepted a cup of coffee but did not drink, just held it between his palms as if drawing warmth from the ceramic. There are stories coming down from the high country, he said finally. Stories about gunplay and dead men. Stories that mention your name. Laura met his gaze steadily. What kind of stories? The kind that say, Deputy U.S. Marshal Laura Hawkins is not as dead as people thought. The kind that have Carl Mendoza asking questions about the widow who lives alone in Pine Ridge Valley. Noah knew. Somehow, the quiet storekeeper had pieced together the truth about her identity. Laura felt a moment of panic, wondering how many others had made the same connection. How long have you known, she asked, since the day you and Thomas first came to town? Noah finally took a sip of his coffee. You see, I was not always a storekeeper. 20 years ago, I wore a badge myself. Deputy Sheriff down in Tucson. I saw you testify at the trial of Blackjack Santee. The memory came flooding back. Santee had been one of the worst, a killer who preyed on isolated homesteads and mining camps. Laura had tracked him for 3 months through some of the most dangerous country in the territory, before finally cornering him in a box canyon near the Mexican border. You brought him in alive, Noah continued. Could have shot him a dozen times, but you wanted him to face justice proper. That took courage and principle. Not many lawmen would have made that choice. He was a rabid dog, but he deserved a trial. Yes, he did. And that is how I knew you were someone special, someone worth keeping an eye on. Laura studied the older man's face, seeing something she had missed before. The way he held himself, the careful positioning of his hands, the alert eyes that never stopped moving. Noah Foster might be a storekeeper now, but he had been something else once. What do you need from me, Noah? Nothing you are not already planning to give. Mendoza sent word to town yesterday. He wants to buy out every homestead in the valley, including yours. Those who refuse to sell will face the consequences. And the town's response. Officially, we stay neutral. Unofficially, Noah's smile was thin and dangerous. There are more retired lawmen in Pine Ridge than you might expect. Men who came here seeking the same peace you found. Men who do not take kindly to threats against their neighbors. Laura felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. She was not alone after all. The quiet community she had thought defenseless was full of people who understood the language of violence and were prepared to speak it fluently when necessary. How many? She asked. Enough. Thomas Perez used to be a cavalry sergeant. Zachary Johnson was a Pinkerton detective. Even old Jessica Baker ran a boarding house that served as a safe house for federal marshals. We all came here to escape our pasts, but we have not forgotten our skills. Then we need to coordinate. Mendoza will not stop with threats, and when he escalates, we need to be ready. Noah nodded grimly. There is a meeting tonight at the church. Unofficial, of course. Just neighbors discussing mutual concerns. Laura understood the meeting would allow them to plan their defense without openly declaring war on Mendoza's organization. It would also give her a chance to assess the capabilities of her potential allies. I will be there, she said. Good. Noah stood and moved toward the door, then paused. Laura, there is something else you should know. Mendoza has been asking questions about your husband, about how he died and whether there might be more to the story. Laura felt ice form in her stomach. Thomas's death had been natural, a heart attack brought on by years of hard living and stress. But if Mendoza was looking for leverage, he might try to twist the circumstances into something sinister. Let him dig, she said. He will not find anything useful. Maybe not, but be careful. Men like Mendoza do not fight fair, and they do not hesitate to use the dead against the living. After Noah left, Laura stood on her porch and looked out over the valley that had become her home. The morning was clear and cold, with snow capping the distant peaks and ice forming at the edges of the stream that ran past her cabin. It was beautiful country, peaceful and clean, the kind of place where a person could forget about the darkness that existed in the world. But darkness had a way of finding you, no matter how far you ran or how well you hid. The church meeting that night revealed the true nature of Pine Ridge's population. What Laura had taken for a community of farmers and shopkeepers was actually a gathering of some of the most dangerous people on the frontier. Thomas Perez had served with the 5th Cavalry during the Apache Wars, and his weathered hands still bore the scars of close-quarters combat. Zachary Johnson had hunted train robbers and bank thieves across half the continent, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had looked death in the face and never blinked. Most surprising of all was Jessica Baker, a gray-haired woman in her 60s who looked like everyone's kindly grandmother. She had run a boarding house in Denver that served as a secret way station for federal marshals and other lawmen, providing safe haven and intelligence to those hunting the territory's most wanted criminals. But it was Kimberly Taylor who provided the most useful information. Kimberly was a school teacher, quiet and unassuming, but she had grown up on a ranch that bordered Mendoza's main holdings. She knew his operation better than anyone in the valley, including the number of men he employed and their usual tactics. Mendoza has maybe 30 gunmen on his payroll, she told the assembled group. Most of them are stationed at his ranch headquarters, but he keeps smaller groups at his mining claims and lumber camps. When he wants to pressure someone, he usually sends 4 or 5 men to make his point. What about the law? Asked Thomas Perez. Can we count on any help from the territorial authorities? Kimberly shook her head. The nearest federal marshal is 3 days' ride from here, and the territorial governor owes Mendoza too many favors. We are on our own. Laura had expected as much. The frontier was full of places where the law existed only in theory, where justice came from the barrel of a gun and the courage of ordinary people who refuse to be intimidated. Then we need to make our own law, she said. Mendoza is used to dealing with frightened farmers and isolated homesteaders. He is not prepared for organized resistance. What do you propose? Asked Noah. We turn his own tactics against him. Mendoza relies on fear and intimidation because most of his targets do not fight back. When his men come calling, they expect to face helpless victims, not professional resistance. Jessica Baker leaned forward, her grandmother's face showing the steel beneath the kindly exterior. You are talking about an ambush. I am talking about justice. Laura's voice was calm but implacable. Mendoza sent men to steal my horses. Those men are now dead or running. When he escalates, we need to be ready to meet force with superior force. The group spent the next hour planning their defense. Pine Ridge Valley had natural choke points that could be defended by a small force against superior numbers. The town itself could be fortified, and the surrounding homesteads could serve as early warning posts. Most importantly, they had something Mendoza lacked: intimate knowledge of the terrain and the motivation that came from defending their homes. As the meeting broke up, Zachary Johnson approached Laura with a grim expression. There is something you need to know about Mendoza's operation. During my Pinkerton days, I investigated some of his business dealings. The man is not just a land grabber. He is connected to some very dangerous people in Denver and San Francisco. People who will not hesitate to bring in outside help if local muscle proves insufficient. How much outside help? Enough to make this valley run red with blood. Johnson's voice was quiet but urgent. Laura, I respect what you did during your marshaling days, and I know you can handle yourself in a fight. But this could become something bigger than any of us can manage alone. Then we make sure it does not come to that. We hit them hard and fast, make the cost too high for them to continue. Mendoza is a businessman first and a killer second. If we make this unprofitable enough, he will move on to easier targets. Johnson nodded slowly. I hope you are right, because if you are wrong, we are all going to die in these mountains. Laura walked home through the cold night air, her breath forming clouds in the moonlight. The valley was silent except for the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hunting owl. It was the kind of night that made her remember why she had chosen this place, why she had thought she could leave her violent past behind and find peace in the wilderness. But peace was a luxury that men like Carl Mendoza would never allow her to enjoy. Back at the cabin, she checked her weapons one final time and settled down to wait. Mendoza would make his next move soon, probably within the next day or two. The theft of her horses had been a probe, a way to test her defenses and gauge her response. Now that he knew she was more than she appeared, he would come with overwhelming force, intending to crush any resistance before it could organize. He was going to be disappointed. Laura had spent 7 years as a federal marshal, hunting men who thought themselves untouchable. She had learned that the key to victory was not superior firepower, but superior preparation. Know your enemy, know your terrain, and know yourself. Everything else was just details. As she drifted off to sleep, her hand resting on the grip of Thomas's Colt, Laura found herself thinking about her husband's last words to her. You cannot run from what you were. You can only choose what you do with it. Tomorrow she would show Carl Mendoza exactly what she chose to do with her past. They came at dawn, just as Laura had expected. She was already awake, had been for an hour, sitting by her window with a cup of coffee and her rifle across her knees. The morning mist hung thick in the valley, providing perfect cover for an approach. But Laura had learned long ago to listen with more than her ears. The horses came slowly, their riders trying to muffle the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground. 12 men, moving in a loose line toward her cabin, their confidence evident in their casual formation. They expected to find a frightened widow, not a federal marshal with 7 years of experience hunting killers. Laura finished her coffee and set the cup aside with deliberate care. Then she moved to the cache beneath the floorboards and retrieved the last items from her past: a box of special ammunition and a small brass whistle that had not been blown in 5 years. The whistle's call was sharp and clear, cutting through the morning air like a blade. To anyone listening, it might have sounded like a bird call or the wind through the eaves. But to those who knew its meaning, it was a signal that had once summoned help across 3 territories. Laura did not expect an immediate response. The whistle was a relic from her marshaling days, when she had worked with a network of informants and allies scattered across the frontier. Most of those people were probably dead or retired, and even if they were alive, they were too far away to help. But old habits died hard, and in her experience, it never hurt to let people know when trouble was coming. The riders were close enough now that she could see their faces through the mist. Carl Mendoza rode at their center, his expensive coat and silver-trimmed saddle marking him as a leader. Beside him rode Ronald Brown, the lieutenant she had seen in her wanted poster collection. The rest were hired guns, professional killers with the cold eyes and steady hands of men who had made death their trade. Laura checked her weapons one final time. The Colt on her right hip was loaded with 6 rounds of standard ammunition. The Peacemaker on her left carried 6 rounds of her special loads, bullets she had crafted herself for situations that required absolute certainty. Her rifle held 15 rounds, and she had 2 more magazines in her coat pocket, 33 bullets against 12 men. The odds were not impossible, but they were not good either. The riders pulled up in front of her cabin, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold air. Mendoza dismounted with theatrical flourish, his movements calculated to demonstrate his confidence and control. "Mrs. Cook," he called out, "I believe we have business to discuss." Laura stepped onto her porch, her rifle held casually but ready. The movement was fluid and natural, the product of years spent facing down dangerous men in dangerous places. "Mr. Mendoza, you are early for a social call." "This is not a social call." Mendoza's voice carried the edge of a man who was used to being obeyed without question. "You cost me 4 good men yesterday, and that requires a response. Your men were thieves. They got what thieves deserve. My men were conducting legitimate business on behalf of their employer. You murdered them in cold blood." Laura's smile was thin and cold. "Self-defense is not murder, Mr. Mendoza, but theft is still theft, even when rich men do it." The insult hit home, and Mendoza's face flushed with anger. "You have spirit, Mrs. Cook. I will give you that. But spirit will not stop bullets, and you are outnumbered 12-1, am I?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mendoza frowned, suddenly uncertain. Something in Laura's tone suggested that the odds might not be as favorable as they appeared. That was when the first shot came from the tree line. Ronald Brown spun in his saddle, a red flower blooming on his shoulder as Thomas Perez's bullet found its mark. The former cavalry sergeant had positioned himself in the pines overlooking the cabin, and his old Spencer rifle spoke with the authority of a man who had learned to shoot during the Indian Wars. The hired guns scattered, seeking cover behind trees and rocks that suddenly seemed inadequate against the precision fire that began raining down from multiple positions. Zachary Johnson emerged from behind the barn, his twin pistols barking in measured cadence. Jessica Baker appeared at an upstairs window of the cabin across the valley, her rifle cracking like a whip as she added her fire to the growing symphony of violence. Mendoza dove behind his horse, his face a mask of shock and rage. This was not how the confrontation was supposed to go. He had brought overwhelming force to crush a single woman, not to fight a pitched battle against professional gunmen. Laura stepped off the porch and into the chaos, her movements calm and deliberate. The Colt appeared in her hand as if by magic, and her first shot took down the gunman trying to flank Johnson's position. Her second bullet shattered the rifle of another man, sending splinters of wood and metal flying. "You made a mistake, Mr. Mendoza," she called out over the gunfire. "You assumed I was alone." The battle raged for 10 minutes that felt like hours. Mendoza's men were professionals, but they had been caught completely off guard by the coordinated resistance. They had expected to face a frightened widow, not a network of retired lawmen who knew every inch of the terrain and had planned their defense down to the smallest detail. One by one, the hired guns fell or fled. Some took bullets and went down hard, their bodies sprawled in the snow like broken dolls. Others broke and ran when they realized they were facing superior numbers and better tactics. In the end, only Mendoza remained, crouched behind his dying horse with a pistol in his shaking hand. His expensive coat was torn and bloody, and his silver-trimmed saddle lay in the mud beside him. Laura approached slowly, her Colt trained on his position. Around the cabin, her allies emerged from their cover, weapons ready, but the immediate threat neutralized. "It is over, Mr. Mendoza. Drop your gun, and we can discuss terms." "Terms?" Mendoza's laugh was bitter and desperate. "You think this ends here? You think killing a few hired guns will make me go away? I think you are a businessman who has just learned that this particular business venture is unprofitable. Laura's voice was calm and reasonable, the tone of someone offering a fair deal. Cut your losses and move on. There are easier targets than Pine Ridge Valley. You do not understand. Mendoza struggled to his feet, his pistol wavering between Laura and the other defenders. This is not about land or money anymore. This is about reputation. If word gets out that Carl Mendoza was beaten by a handful of farmers and shopkeepers, I will lose everything. Then you should have thought of that before you came here. The standoff stretched for long seconds, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Mendoza's finger tightened on the trigger, and Laura could see the desperation in his eyes. He was a man with nothing left to lose, which made him more dangerous than any professional killer. The shot, when it came, was not from Mendoza's gun. Kimberly Taylor stepped out from behind the cabin, a smoking rifle in her hands and determination written across her face. Her bullet had taken Mendoza's center mass, dropping him where he stood before he could pull the trigger on his own weapon. The school teacher looked down at the body with no visible emotion, then broke open her rifle to reload with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this before. "He was going to kill you," she said simply. "I could not let that happen." Laura holstered her Colt and walked over to check Mendoza's body. The man who had terrorized the valley for years was dead, his expensive clothes soaking up blood and mud in equal measure. It was an ignoble end for someone who had thought himself untouchable. "Thank you," Laura said. "That was a clean shot. My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Kimberly's voice was steady, but Laura could see the slight tremor in her hands. "He said a woman on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself and those she cared about." The other defenders gathered around Mendoza's body, their faces grim but satisfied. They had won a decisive victory, but the cost was evident in the blood staining the snow and the bodies scattered around the cabin. "What do we do now?" asked Noah Foster. "Mendoza is dead, but he had partners, people who will want answers." "We tell the truth," Laura replied. "Carl Mendoza came here with armed men to force people from their homes. He was met with lawful resistance and died in the resulting gunfight. Any investigation will bear that out. And his organization will collapse without him. Men like Mendoza rule through fear and personal charisma. With him gone, his lieutenants will turn on each other fighting for control. The threat to Pine Ridge Valley dies with him." Thomas Perez limped over from his position in the trees, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage on his leg. One of the hired guns had gotten lucky with a wild shot, but the wound was not serious. "We need to get the bodies cleared and the wounded tended," he said. "And we need to decide what story we tell when the authorities come asking questions." "The truth," Laura repeated. "We are law-abiding citizens who defended our homes against armed criminals. Everything we did was legal and justified. Even the part where a federal marshal who was supposed to be dead led the defense." Laura considered this for a moment. The secret of her identity was out now, blown open by the morning's violence. There was no putting that particular cat back in the bag, especially that part. Deputy U.S. Marshal Laura Hawkins was never dead, just retired. And when criminals threaten her community, retirement ends. The cleanup took most of the day. The dead were wrapped and loaded onto a wagon for transport to town, where the territorial authorities could deal with the paperwork and legal formalities. The wounded were tended by Jessica Baker, whose boarding house experience had included serving as an informal nurse for injured lawmen. As the sun began to set over Pine Ridge Valley, Laura found herself standing on her porch once again, looking out over the land that had become her home. The snow was stained with blood in places, and the peaceful morning routine had been shattered by violence. But the valley was still beautiful, still worth defending. Noah Foster approached, his hat in his hands and a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "So what happens now, Laura? Do you go back to marshaling, or do you stay here and raise horses?" Laura considered the question carefully. The morning's events had awakened something in her that she had thought buried with Thomas. The satisfaction of standing up to bullies, the clarity that came from fighting for something worth defending, the sense of purpose that had driven her through 7 years of hunting killers. But she had also rediscovered something else, the value of community, the strength that came from standing together against those who would prey on the innocent. "I think," she said slowly, "that Pine Ridge Valley could use a sheriff, someone to keep the peace and make sure that what happened here today never happens again." Noah's smile was broad and genuine. "I think the town council would be very interested in discussing that possibility with you, Sheriff Hawkins." The title felt strange on her tongue, different from the federal authority she had once carried, but no less meaningful. A sheriff was part of the community in a way that a marshal never could be, responsible not just for enforcing the law, but for protecting the people who made a place worth defending. As night fell over the valley, Laura went inside and carefully cleaned her weapons before returning them to their resting places. The Colt went back into its holster, the Peacemaker into its place of honor on the mantelpiece, but she did not return them to the cache beneath the floorboards. Those days of hiding were over. She was Laura Hawkins again, but she was also Laura Cook, the widow who had found peace in the wilderness and the marshal who had never failed to bring justice to those who deserved it. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt whole. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of winter. But inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and bright, and Laura Hawkins slept the sleep of someone who had found her place in the world once again. The last thing she heard before drifting off was the distant sound of a horse nickering softly in the barn. Black Tusk was safe, the valley was secure, and justice had been served. It was enough. In the years that followed, the story of the gunfight at Pine Ridge Valley became legend across the territories. They said that a quiet widow had faced down 12 armed men with nothing but an old pistol and nerves of steel. They said she had been a famous marshal once, a woman who could track ghosts and shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards. Most of the stories were exaggerated, but the core truth remained. When evil came calling on Pine Ridge Valley, it met its match in Laura Hawkins. She served as sheriff for 15 years, keeping the peace with the same quiet competence that had made her reputation as a marshal. The badge on her chest was different, the jurisdiction smaller, but the principles remained the same. Protect the innocent, punish the guilty, and never let the darkness win. The valley prospered under her protection. New families came to settle the rich land, drawn by stories of a place where honest people could live without fear. The town grew from a collection of rough buildings to a proper community with a school, a church, and a main street lined with prosperous businesses. Laura never married again, but she was never truly alone. The bonds forged in that morning's violence proved stronger than steel, and the community that had stood together against Carl Mendoza continued to stand together through good times and bad. When she finally hung up her badge at the age of 62, the town council tried to talk her out of retirement. But Laura had earned her rest, and she was content to spend her remaining years training horses and watching the valley she had helped to build. She did it peacefully in her sleep on a winter morning, much like the one when Mendoza had come calling. The funeral was attended by people from across the territory, including several federal marshals who had served with her in the old days, and a surprising number of former outlaws who credited her with giving them the chance to go straight. They buried her in the cemetery overlooking the valley, with a simple headstone that bore her name and dates in a single line, quote 0. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the valley itself, peaceful and prosperous, a place where children could grow up safe and families could build their dreams without fear. It was the legacy of a woman who had chosen to stand and fight when others would have run, who had proven that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one who looked least threatening. The old cabin still stands, though it has been expanded and modernized over the years. The current owners, a young family with 2 children and dreams of their own, know the history of their home. They know about the widow who became a legend, about the morning when evil came calling and found itself outgunned and outmatched. Sometimes on quiet mornings when the mist clings to the valley floor, they say you can still hear the echo of that long-ago gunfight, the sharp crack of rifles, the thunder of hoofbeats, and beneath it all, the calm voice of a woman who refused to be intimidated by men who thought they owned the world. They laughed at a widow's old pistol, thinking it was just decoration, a relic from a bygone era. They never understood that some weapons are more than steel and gunpowder. Some weapons are forged from principle and tempered with courage, and those weapons never fail when the moment comes to draw. Laura Hawkins knew that truth better than most. She lived it, fought with it, and died secure in the knowledge that she had used her gifts to make the world a little bit safer for those who came after her. Her six-shooter had never failed a draw, but more importantly, neither had she. The legend of Pine Ridge Valley lives on, a reminder that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is the quiet determination of someone who refuses to let evil win. In a time when the frontier was ruled by fear and violence, Laura Hawkins proved that courage and competence could triumph over any odds. They laughed at a widow's old pistol. They died learning that their laughter was premature, their confidence misplaced, and their understanding of true strength fatally flawed. Some lessons are written in blood, carved into memory by the sharp edge of justice served. The men who rode into Pine Ridge Valley that morning learned such a lesson, though few lived to share it. The lesson was simple: never underestimate a quiet woman with steady hands and nothing left to lose. Laura Hawkins was such a woman, and her story serves as both warning and inspiration to all who hear it. The frontier was a hard place that bred hard people, but it also created legends. And sometimes, just sometimes, those legends were exactly what they appeared to be. Ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. Her six-shooter had never failed a draw, and when the final accounting was made, neither had the woman who carried it.